Hey, everybody, and welcome. Welcome once again to another episode here of Political Pain. I've got my little silent co star here in the back, but I am very excited today to welcome a very special guest who is here to discuss with me 1824 and the Chumash War, uprising, rebellion against the California missions. My guest today. If I may get her in here. Hello, my guest today is Marianne Parra. Marianne is a Chumash descendant and descendant of people who took part in the rebellion. But I'll let Marianne introduce herself and again say welcome here to Political Pain.
Haku aku kianti kakti Marianne. Hello, my name is Marianne Parra. Um, I descend from Chumash that were at La Purisima Mission, Santa Ines Mission, Santa Barbara Mission, Ventura Mission, and some that were taken to San Fernando Mission. So there are some Chumash that have lineage from many different villages and areas, and I just happen to be one of those people.
Very good, thank you, Marianne. And so, tell me a bit about. We could think of this almost like a kind of oral history. When did you first become aware of your ancestry and what that meant? And what were some of your formative experiences with that growing up?
So for me, I feel like I have the unique experience and was really fortunate that I was born straight out of the womb knowing I was Chumash. My mom gave birth to me, and about 8 months later, she was in the hospital for about 6 months. Had been really sick. So my auntie and my grandmother took care of me, and my grandmother is a Chumash plant medicine woman. So from a very early on age, I've always known that I was Chumash. That's all I knew. So I spent a lot of time at extended families' homes on the reservation. I have family there. This was before the casino, so the whole upper res didn't exist. The casino didn't exist. It was just dirt road. And to me, those times were priceless because I had such an advantage to grow up with community members where all the neighbors were Chumash. There wasn't like neighborhoods like today. I think the reservations, a lot of people, come down on them and say a lot of negative things, but ultimately, all of your people live in that area. All your lessons, all your elders, everything is taught there. And that experience is priceless because there's nothing else like it that exists today. We were just taken out of our homelands. So that is the only reservation for the Chumash that exists. And there was supposed to be a reservation in Santa Barbara, but that land was taken long ago, and it's never going to be given back. Some of these places we'll never see again just because of the real estate and the value on the beautiful territory that we live on.
Absolutely. If you could speak on that for a moment, because like you said, Santa Ynez is the federally recognized tribe of Chumash, but it's not the only Chumash there are. I'm studying the Chumash Rebellion in 1824. We'll get to that, but really, the majority of time of California, as we know it today, for thousands of years, the Chumash lived in the way that they lived. I think of it geographically from around Ventura area up through Santa Barbara, the Central Coast, up into San Luis Obispo. But it also involved inland areas. What do you know about that? What is the traditional range of the Chumash? And then we can start talking about how the missions really invaded uh, Chumash lands and territory and what they did.
Okay. So, yes, Santa Ynez is the only federally recognized group. There is less than 5,000 Chumash in existence. We know that about 320 on the reservation and only about 100 and give or take, 20 are actually receive per capita checks. Um, and then everybody else is spread out because of loss of land. We were pushed out, moved, taken off the islands. And so for us, the state of California has no state recognition. They only have federal recognition. Other than that, you have to have a nonprofit, and they call that a quote unquote band, or you can call it a circle. So our group is if you know, there's a lot of there's only 3 different bands of Chumash that are all Chumash and that can trace their lineage back and are on the rolls for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's a couple of other groups out there, and my aunt, before the Ventura group banded in the 90s, she had a group previous to that, late 70s through late 80s. Um, and at that time, there are other Chumash around, but sometimes they don't join a group because of just differences, not getting along, fractured communities. After everything we've been through, there's a lot that goes on into it, which is fine. People can choose to have their own group. We have really tried. So ours is Hilstikoi Hilhus, and it roughly translates to those who gather around the bear. So we really try to stick to our ancestral practices. Even though we're living in a modern day society, we really try to retain those practices, because we believe that if we do not retain the practices, we're no longer those people. We have now changed and modified who we are to modern times, which to me puts a huge gap between who we were and who we are. Now, before the Shumash were here, we're roughly the Oak Grove people. So that indigenous tribe is who we descend from, and I'm a type of person that does believe in oral history, but I also pair that with science. I believe you have to marry the two to really get the full picture. That's just my personal belief. I know people have other beliefs, but I love that when I say the land, literally our blood, sweat, and tears is in this land. When you have our mitochondrial DNA tested, you can show that we descend from this area 10,000 plus years. And so when I say the land literally lives within our DNA, there's no denying that we are the people of this land. My grandmother, my father, my aunt, my uncle, one of my daughters, they all show this very, very ancient DNA. Still, we're carrying it through our bloodline. And for me, that makes me very, very proud and very happy to be who I am.
Very good. And this connection to the land. Before we, before we get to missionization and all of that, like, how do you experience that in your life? And I think a lot of people feel a certain way when they approach the Pacific Ocean, but I can only imagine, like, the connection you must feel to it, knowing that your ancestors were piloting, across the channel, and thriving in this region for so long, and connected to the ecology of it.
Yeah, so for me, it's funny. When my kids all learned to swim, they all learned to swim in the ocean here in Ventura and Santa Barbara. We always swam from a very young age. And people would ask me, why do you put your kids in the ocean? It's so dirty and it's so dangerous. But that's how I learned. So I continued to teach them as I had learned. Um, which for me was incredibly important. And it was just always, I was always told, it's this funny little saying. It's an ancient saying. It says, any good Chumash woman can swim out to the reef and back. And so obviously the land, the lay of the land is very different than it used to be. But that was like mine and my cousins always, our race against each other. Who could swim the farthest out? Who could swim the fastest? And who could swim back? So I never made my kids race out there, but I did teach them how to understand the ocean, from the different types of waves, from the wind, from just the energy that you feel out there. And a lot of times you'll see this in what marine life is out there. When the surfers out there, they have learned to navigate these waves also. And they're not indigenous, but somebody who respects and loves the ocean, right? They understand that they need to learn from the ocean, not the ocean learning from them.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. It'll teach you a thing or two if you're not too careful.
It will. Mother Nature has a good way of holding you accountable for the things that you do.
Yeah. Now, speaking of holding accountable, let's address the settler-colonial elephant in the room, and that's the Spanish missions. As Californians, and especially Blancos like me, the missions very easily just fall into the background of our state, and they become a pastiche and kind of an aesthetic, right? The archways and the Spanish tile, and people, I think, because we all learn about them during fourth grade, we have a very fourth grade view of the missions. But I think a lot of people, as they get older, maybe if they've read Island of the Blue Dolphins or something that exposed them to a bit more of the devastation that people faced, I think people, as they mature, they get they tend to look at the missions a little more skeptically, but generally speaking, there's not another California state history curriculum that happens around the missions after fourth grade. So people very much live with this very surface idea of the missions and what they were like. For you, and in your experience, and of course, taking in what you've learned, like you said, science and all of that, but I just mean, what you knew and learned growing up and what your family knew and how you discussed it. How does that pale with what most Californians are exposed to in their public education about the Spanish missions? What were they, and how did they really affect your people?
Well, to me, I'm probably going to work backwards from this question. So for
That's
me,
fine.
I always understood and knew that the mission was a terrible place. This is how my grandmother explained it to me. Even though, there was some assimilation, even with her to survive, I completely understand that. I don't hold them guilty out that, but she did really explain to me it was a terrible place from what she learned from her aunt, who was the last full-blooded Chumash of the village of Wainimu, which we know today as Wainimi. Stories that she had heard from her family. So when we think about it, we're not that many generations away from family members that were in the mission system. So I always knew about it. My grandmother had taken me to the Santa Ines mission when I was very young. I want to say maybe 5 or 6. And people always say, we can't teach young kids this. It's not their minds won't understand it. They're too young. It's brutal, but yet we'll take them to a Catholic church that shows Jesus Christ nailed to the cross with the crown of thorns, bleeding, with nails in his hands. And I'm like, if they can learn that, they can learn about the mission system. I taught my kids, like I said, my grandmother took me out very young. I'm sorry, I've got to jump up for a second. She walked me out to the mission in Santa Ynez, and she took me out to a spot, and she said, "This is where my aunt was raped by a Spanish soldier. I'm letting you know because everything about the mission isn't the way they make it seem. It's very important. I mean, she always instilled in us, do not forget your history. You need to know where you came from. You need to know what happened to your people." And I was mortified because and that's one of those memories that's deeply burned into my mind because there is fear behind that. It's happened before. What's to say it couldn't happen again? There's so much going on politically, and Shumash have only been citizens of the United States for 100 years. So, what could change? What can they continue to take away from us? Because they're slowly but surely giving some things back, but we never know what can change. We never know what can happen. These missions are still there. I always took my children to the missions to visit, not because I thought the missions were special or important, but I always let them know this is where our ancestors are buried. We don't get the option to remove them, rebury them. And at the end of the day, I don't know that I really want to disturb them in that manner. But in order to visit them and let them know, we have gone and done ceremony for the Chumash that were killed during the revolt. We do it every year. We also would always take them and let our ancestors know your body is here, but your spirit is free. You do not have to stay here. You're free to leave if you choose to. So for me, it was very important for them to know where our ancestors were buried and what happened in the revolt. When they were in school, when I was in school, we weren't so much making missions, but they did talk about it. And I would get in trouble because I would always say, my grandma said that it wasn't all good, that bad things happened there. And I would get in trouble all the
Yeah.
time. They'd always pull me into the office. They'd always call my mom, and my mom would come pick me up and explain to them. But these things are real. These really happen to the family. They
Yeah.
just weren't going to talk about it. They were not going to talk about it in the 80s. They certainly weren't ready to talk about it 15 years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And this
so,
is here locally in
yeah, yeah, this was in Oxnard and Ventura schooling.
oh, yeah.
And so when my kids were born and they got to the fourth grade, I had this fight with them every year in school. We're not making a mission. We're not making a mission. And by law, they told me you had to make a mission. I said, so if we're going to make a mission, I am only going to add um, little native figurines and the animals, and we're going to make our own little village in here. And we did. We put the friar, whether or not, I mean, people will say it's immature, that's childish. It's just how I felt. We put the friar in the fountain. We said we're just putting them in there. And it's just because you're constantly told you're too angry, you shouldn't feel this way, you should be forgiving, you shouldn't gossip, all these things that Western civilization and religion teaches you. But that's not okay. We're allowed to be angry. We're allowed to feel our emotions. And we should never have been forced. We would never, ever, ever, ever force Jewish children to make concentration camps. We would never do this. This is horrendous. So why is it different for brown children? Why is it we're seeing historically, even with African Americans, they don't feel the same, they don't think the same, they'll be okay. And that's not it. It's traumatizing. It is very traumatizing. It's hurtful. I understand that they love the mission. That's something they built and they believe in, but you can't force that everybody to love something that almost destroyed an entire tribe of people.
Yeah, I mean, and many many tribes, and in repeating fashion. It's. I mean, I think we see a lot how history has become politicized. Not become, always kind of has been, and in the case of this story specifically, so for anybody who doesn't know, and I've been trying to talk about it more and more on the channel, and I'm really happy to have you here to discuss it. But in 1824, you have these three missions: Santa Barbara, Santa Ines, La Purisima. Santa Barbara is on the ocean-facing side of a mountain range, and Santa Ines and La Purisima are on the north side of that mountain range, more inland. But they're all within a day's or afternoon's walk to each other. But so you have, these three missions are kind of a constellation of missions that work with the Presidio in Santa Barbara, the military outpost, to kind of, there's a lot of exchange of goods and people between these missions, family ties. And there's, I would love to hear your take on what the family story is, side of the story is, what the family lore is, because the Chumash oral history narratives, bring in an interesting outlook that's somewhat different from what the Franciscan Spaniards were saying. They're blaming the Mexican military. The Mexican military are pointing the fingers at the Spaniards. And Chumash oral history kind of suggests that this thing was being planned. It was already in the works, and it might have got kicked off early. But we can get into the details of it. But this really is the largest armed insurrection against the California missions in their entire history.
Yeah.
I think it's this massively radical moment that, even though the Spaniards and Mexico want to downplay this in the archive, and no, it wasn't that big of a deal. This is a rupture that is like the beginning. 10 years later, the missions are secularized, and things just keep changing. But if you could just go ahead and take it from there, like when you first learned about it, and what you've always understood about 1824.
Like I said, I learned about it fairly young. My grandmother always taught me, I mean, everything, just about everything I learned from her and our cousin Irene on the reservation. But yeah, she told me very early, like I said, she took me out to the missions. La Purísima was the first mission, and then we went out to San Ynez. And like so she walked me out and showed me, the area where her aunt, which would be like my great great aunt, had been raped. And she felt that it was very important to let us know what happened. What was Some people say it wasn't allowed. Some people say, well, there was only a few friars, but there was all these Spanish soldiers. But at the end of the day, those friars were responsible for those soldiers and their behavior. The friars could have packed up and left and said, if you are not going to treat these people right, we're not going to establish this mission. If it's based on these principles of God, I don't think that that's something that would be a principle of any religious figure. But everybody has their opinion, everybody has their story. I know that there's two stories within the Chumash community. We know for sure that there was a young boy that was beat, that went to visit, but because he questioned, and probably in true Chumash style, a little sassy, and that's okay, asked the soldier. But in those days, especially somebody from another country that was had the over governance over us, didn't like it, was upset. And we have to admit that some of these soldiers were not just soldiers because they were fighting or serving their country. It's because I do believe a lot of these people had, issues with narcissism, with power and control issues, with abuse, and they were free to abuse us in any way, shape, or form. So this young man, this young boy was severely beat for being smart with the guard and asking him a question. But it was also said that they had been planning this revolt before that happened. And I believe that as well, because we know that the Shumash, there's many excerpts and quotes from other elders that were in the system at the time of how unhappy they were, how much they wanted to go back to life as we knew it, and they couldn't figure out or know exactly how to get there. There's also several stories about different things, why they burned and took away our plants, our native plant medicine, and didn't allow us to use it, because they know that we could treat, heal, and or poison people if we needed to. And so when different things were going on, they tried to eliminate all of our access to anything that we had that could help us. But when the pirates were coming through, they were looking for gold and other things that Shumash just didn't have. We didn't know or understand what gold is. Our treasures were the shells, and that's not what they wanted. But because the friars had experienced them, and the missions, the churches had gotten a lot of their gold stolen, that's in turn how they taught the Shumash how to fight when these a lot of pirates have gone through Ventura and Santa Barbara coasts.
Yeah,
So
that
there's a lot of interesting history that kind of hits all sorts of different continents. And, we have the fur trappers, and it just goes, there's a lot of people that came through here. So it seems like it would be a lot of chaos living in those days. And I can completely understand why they would want to go back to their village life.
Yeah. Oh, most definitely. And the more I study 1824 and everything around it, the more complicated it gets. Because not only was there, some scholars point to there being a recent drought, that the crop yields hadn't been great because of drought. Some scholars point to epidemic, and these were things that the Chumash had been dealing with for years, and even pre-contact in the case of drought. But then you have all the politics swirling around it. Mexico has a war for independence in 1810, and then there's a counter revolution to that, and a weird local monarchy, the Iturbide monarchy, and then the secular republic is reestablished the same year. So the same year the Chumash are rebelling, or staging this war, the Franciscans are being told that they have to swear fealty to the new Mexican secular
Yeah.
state, and they're mad about it. They're literally complaining about these new laws, and they're emboldening. Look what they're doing. They're emboldening the Indians. So, and then you mentioned the pirates. There was a Bouchard, was a Portuguese guy who was raiding Spanish missions. So you have, in the years preceding the uprising, the Father Ripoll and them drilling the Chumash on how to use guns, how to do the basics of a militia or a junta. So I think that another thing that's fascinating to me is, so you have this outbreak of violence at Santa Ynez. They abandon Santa Barbara, take all their stuff, and leave. They occupy La Purisima, very radical. This is ours now. But you have this combination of people fleeing to the interior, relying on their ancestral knowledge, people fleeing in their canoes for the islands. But then you also have them wielding guns, roping the horses, like being way better at controlling the horses than than the Mexican military are. They totally outdo them because they're the laborers after all. They're the vaqueros, but they also they do political pomp and circumstance. They you know they have diplomats and diplomacy, and they wave flags like when they come to meet. And so there's this synergy of the traditional with everything that was new to their world, all this politics and stuff. Like, how do you see it? What are some of the conversations you have about 1824 and just all the different things that were the aspects of it?
Well, I think 1824 during the revolt, I'm actually very proud to say that, we had family or had ancestors that I don't like to always use the word. My dog keeps opening the door. Use the word ancestors because it makes it sound like it was in a time so long ago, and it really wasn't. It really wasn't that long ago. Um, but I think during that time sounds like an amazing time, right? We're tired. We've been tired of living in these ways that they have tried to force us to stay in. And we, in order to survive, right, we're assimilating, we're doing the things that we need to do to survive, all while still planning not being able to speak our language. And it really gives, from what I have learned from my family, is that, and I know the scholars say, no, this didn't happen, there's no writing of it. But I was taught that, and we know as Indigenous people, we use our hands a lot to speak. We use gestures. We know through the Chumash language, it was very, we use gestures because we're not writing with our hands. We're not using exclamation marks, question marks. We were very animated when we spoke. So it makes sense to me that we would be using hand signals and some what would be considered the first sign language to talk to people or to give signs about what was happening or what to expect. I believe that full heartedly. I believe during this time, we know very few people were able to jump in their tamol and leave to the island because of the fact that there was limited amount of tamols because the mission got rid of most of them. They burned most of them, didn't allow us to use them. And we know through our natural travel ways and our paths that we used to go through that we went through the mountains. Santa Barbara went through the mountains. There was elders killed, unfortunately, during the revolt. Some people didn't were making their journey from Santa Barbara to La Purisima when they had left earlier before the news was we need to get out, and running into soldiers and soldiers asking them, what are they doing? Where are they going? And they're letting them know they go to visit, and they're just killed. They're on their way. So those Rapoli is one who went out and collected all the Shumash bodies from the elders, brought them back to the mission to bury them. I am thankful for that because we know where they're buried. We know that their bodies weren't just left discarded on the land. They were cared for even after in death, given a proper Shumash burial. We know that elders, women and children, including Ernestine's grandmother, babies were carried through that route. They walked that entire route to get out to the interior, which is gosh, I can't think of the name of the lake now, the campsite which it's near.
Buena Vista.
Um, yes, yes, and I have been there, and they say it's haunted, and I full heartedly believe that. I can understand why it's haunted. And we know that we stayed there until we could no longer stay there. And I understand the Yokuts why the fight wasn't with them, why they would ask us, they're gonna come and they're gonna come looking for you guys. You've got to go because they're gonna bring more trouble, and it wouldn't be fair to them. And it makes sense because Shumash were ancestrally, right? They had a lot of, I can't think of the word, compromise. We're used to sitting and talking. There was a chief, he had an assistant, he had an entire elders council, he also had two spiritual counselors. So we sat and talked about these things, what was important, what we needed to do, and we would never bring that type of harm upon another group of people just because we're trying to hide out. We were reasonable. So when it was time to go home, we know the majority of people left and went home. Few stayed out there,
Yeah.
probably intermarried. Um, but from what I understand, is Chumash territory is Morro Bay, San Luis, parts of San Morro Bay, because some of it is Selenian territory also,
Hmm.
all the way out to Malibu. And my grandmother was actually given the land grant to Malibu, but like traditionally, like I said, um, Indigenous people did not inherit the wealth or land of their ancestors. Once that person died, they split it up, sell it, do what they do. And we know Malibu as we know today.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to give up any piece of land to us just because my grandmother, and we have the actual land grant. But
Wow.
unfortunately, it's not like today. If you go into court and you say, I have this deed, this is my place, that's even becoming more and more complicated in today's society, in today's courts in California. You would think that nobody could take your house, and they can.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's very interesting. It's very sad that we know that elders and children died, all just trying to get away, trying to survive. But that resilience, that fight to continue to stand up for what they believe in and for that way of life, is incredibly rich and is so important to me, because that's how I knew my grandmother. She was very small, like 4'9".
Hmm.
Just a very powerful, strong woman. And she is somebody, maybe not always in the way they wanted her to, but she always said she was Chumash. She never delineated from that. A lot of families will say, yeah, they didn't admit they were Chumash. They didn't want to be Indian. They were embarrassed. They didn't want to deal with the repercussions of it. But she did. She faced a lot of prejudiceness and abuse. And so for me, I'm like, how could I ever deny who I am or my ancestry or not learn more about it? And because she always taught me who she was and what she went through. And she's one of the few people, we learned that right throughout history. There's few people that stand up and say, no, I'm not just going with the flow. Like she always said, only dead fish go with the flow.
Yeah.
So I often use that quote of hers because it is very true. So I think that must have been an incredible scene that was going on, but the strength and the power of the man. And it makes sense, right? We're going to do better with animals because we understand animals. We know animals. We may not have had horses here ancestrally. They were brought over, but even we could work with, we're not going to abuse the animals. We're not going to be mean to them. We're not going to hit them. We know how to work with an animal. So it makes sense to me that they could get the animals and work better with them than even the Spanish soldiers.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and yeah, I have the sources. I have the letters of the Mexican soldiers complaining that I don't know how to catch the horses. They've stolen all the horses. The Indians have all the horses. I have holes in my shoes. I can't even go out and get them, and they make all the shoes anyway. So
Yeah.
so it really is that kind of thing. I guess you talked about some of the experiences your grandmother shared with you of what mission life was like, but to me 1824 is a good example of to really having to sit with why would these people um, go so far against the missions. Why would they set Santa Ynez on fire? Why would they shoot at the soldiers in Santa Barbara and hold La Purisima and fight a battle to hold it that they probably knew they weren't going to win, or they might have thought they could, but what, like, that's the other thing is that is interesting about this is because there's a lot of dichotomy, and that's what I try to sit with too. When you have a revolution and a counter revolution, you're going to have parts of it that seem successful, like hundreds of people never did return. The number of people, I was looking at the report that De la Guerra sends to Arguello, the governor, after saying how
Mhm.
many people are here now, how many people do we actually have back, and it's hundreds less than they had before. So there were hundreds of people who never went back, the hundreds who did, but even then, bringing the people back, we could see that as a defeat for the Chumash. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that would appeal to somebody: their land, their sense of home,
Yeah.
the place that they had always known, even though they are going to return to and again, we need to look at how horrific the missions were: forced labor regime, social control. You use like the term
You were a
concentration
prisoner
camp.
essentially.
You compared to saying concentration camps earlier. Like, I don't think people understand that that's how the missions loom to Indigenous Californians. I mean, how do you sit with that, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I believe that their sole goal was to eradicate us in any way possible. They knew, because they have done it to other indigenous tribes all over the world. The Spanish conquered, or I don't want to use the word conquered. They decimated a lot of people. They read it to us as they were the conquerors, but it was an unfair fight. It was an unknown fight in the beginning. They knew that if you take people off the land and they do not have access to their native foods and plants, they will eventually get sick and die. They've been to other places and done this before. We weren't the first people, but they knew they wanted that land, and they knew, because when they first came to us, we were trusting and kind, and greeted them as we would any other guest. But we didn't anticipate what was going to happen. And I do believe that they stood up and fight, not because I do believe they thought that they could win. They could have never predicted how much of a change would come after the mission system. Once so many people had traveled to this land and have seen what our territory looks like and what it had to offer. It was such a rich, beautiful area. And it's I don't know, the only thing I can compare it to, honestly, is as a mother, and unfortunately I have been a victim of domestic violence in the past. I know that when you're in a situation and you're fighting for your kids or your own life, you'll die on your knees, whatever you have to protect your own. That's just how I feel about it. And I truly believe that that's how they looked at the situation. They were willing, it's going to make me emotional though, they were willing to die for their way of life and everything that they had before, because they ultimately lived in paradise. We did have accountability, we did have systems, but those systems worked for us for thousands of years. We provided food for everyone, even if somebody was not living in our immediate village site for whatever reason. They were still given clothing and food to use. So we didn't just abandon people and throw them out as we do now in today's society. We still cared for them and tried to help them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth noting. I mean, I've been looking at the sources from like the Portola expedition, which was a lot of it was by foot, and you have all this the diary of Father Juan Crespi, and every Chumash village that that's how they named Carpinteria, was after the people they found building their tumults. But every village they go to, they're inundated with more gifts of fish than they can possibly eat, than they can carry. There's this. You talk about the friendliness and the peacefulness. It's not like there weren't squabbles, or there
Yeah.
wasn't conflict. That's naive. But when you're living in abundance and thriving, we find that this shell bead currency, hundreds of miles inland, and mussel shells and everything inland. We find goods from the inland on the coast in the archaeology, right? So we see this thriving culture, and then it really it's massively disruptive. The missions are massively disruptive, and I don't want to also be any kind of thought that like this frame here shows from the beginning of the California missions there was violent resistance by the indigenous people. Missions. This is a drawing from Mission San Diego. They were not kind to Father Jaime. Yeah, and but it's interesting because even the Franciscans had way of adapting this type of thing into their worldview. Well, he's a martyr, and they literally have these paintings that show Franciscans like riddled with arrows, to show almost their saintliness. So
Yes.
they had ways of trying to adapt to the fact that indigenous people did not want them around. They didn't feel like they needed them around. They rightfully connected them with the disease that they could not control. They rightly connected them with the brutality of the military, because that's another thing. The Franciscans never would have, Junipero Serra never would have had the success that they had in this colonial endeavor if it weren't backed by military force. If people don't know, every mission had soldiers at it,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
that is a big part of how that played in 1824. I mean, to me, it just seems like a natural response. The Chumash are responding with militancy to this very militant carceral institution, it seems.
Yes, it's almost like right, each one was a prison. You have all these soldiers and guards, and women are kept in one quote unquote dorm, no windows, no ventilation, not even allowed to sleep with their husbands. Like that wasn't by, oh, let's just try it this way. Let's try to figure out what works. That was all designed and planned. Um, so I do believe, they saw the brutal force and how they worked. So they knew they had to meet them with the same force. But I do understand what you're saying, the Franciscans, because right, that is heavily, I don't want to name just one religion, but that is, I feel like a theme that runs through religion is the more a saintly man has suffered, the more godly he is. I don't really understand that. But then they're also given that permission to put brutality and violence, including sexual violence, and we're just supposed to let it slide or understand because he is of God that that's allowed. And it's just absolutely mind blowing to me. It's disgusting. That is not true, but that is a theme that still lives today very heavily. Like if you are of God and you believe in God, then you're supposed to have this natural suffering. And if you were sexually abused or somebody did something to you, you're not supposed to tell anybody because then that's gossip and gossip is bad. So we don't tell these lies about people. And it's just a complete huge colonizer view of how, and I mean, like I said, it's still alive today, right? We hear this ongoing with the church, we hear this ongoing with prisons and jails about women, inmates, even men being sexually assaulted and abused. I think that the narrative has been spun and so hardly hammered into people that everything is good that came from colonization. They came here because we were sleeping on floors, we didn't have proper heating, that we were just living out with no clothes. We didn't know shame. The weather here at that time did not require us to be completely covered up. We were not like the plains in the Southwest. We didn't have to wear that heavy fur. We did have furs, but we didn't wear tops because we were just natural. I mean, I think that's a wonderful lifestyle. Living on the beach topless, living our daily life with our families and friends, laughing, eating, having ceremony, dancing together. What more could you ask for? And somebody comes in and says, "No, no, no, this is too much of a too beautiful lifestyle. We need to change this." And we're never going back to those times. And it seems like everything, as we see the new administration coming in, sending everybody back to work when they could work from the leisure of their home. Why do we always have to be in a building locked inside, either in a school, in a place of work? Unless you're a doctor or nurse where you need to be in these places, it's really not necessary. We don't need to be commuting in our cars for hours to be in this buildings for the same amount of work or productivity, if not more, we can do at home where we're comfortable and have access to our own, to what we can, take care of our needs at home.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, if we really get in to the weeds here of 1824, and I think about literally when the Chumash were in the weeds hiding at Buena Vista Lake, there we have some of the very few contemporary accounts from 1824 are interrogations of Chumash who were recovered and were being returned to the missions, and they were at Buena Vista during this time when everybody got away. And the big concern of the Franciscans was everybody living up to our social or social control, a regime of social control. Were they
Yeah.
honoring their marriages? Were they laboring? Were they doing labor like they should? Were they? And the report back was no. They hung out in the sweat lodge most of the day, and they gambled and played games, and they did what they wanted in terms of they didn't honor their marriages. They did what they wanted, and it's one of those things where the hold of colonialism is so tenuous. Like I'm trying to remember the book. I can't remember, but there was one, and it's about like Central American mission history or uh, Northern South American mission history. And one of the Franciscans says their faith it's held on by pins. He's saying that they're not really faithful, and it's like yes, yeah, that's the whole thing is their efforts. I remember once I got to the age and you learn more about the missions, you realize, oh, the Indians, wherever the missions were, didn't actually live in the mission buildings. They lived, they had a village
Mhm.
next to the mission. It's like, how successful are they in civilizing people if they're going to have them live the exact way they've lived, but now they're just next to the mission and so that they're there every day to labor for it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, and it's during mission system, they said, the account is that they were more like dorm like, that the women didn't have windows. But once the mission system ended and they made their little houses, I believe they refer to it as casitas, but it's just, a tiny house really, that were next to there, and they live. And you can still see, I believe there's one or two that are still, I believe at San Ines, they've converted them to an office, maybe, or some of their use, but there's still that area. But it's interesting to see that when they were thousands and thousands of years of ancestral knowledge, they were not going to change overnight. They got people to agree and to believe and kind of like, yeah, yeah, we have to do this, we have to survive. So they lived this way because they didn't have a choice, but they inherently did not change those deep beliefs. And those deep beliefs have carried on even down to me, because how do you deny what your people stood up for and fought against? Um, Hands down, when you talk about history now, I would much rather live like that than we live today. I could do without my phone. I could do without social media. There's just so many things. Everybody has their own opinion, but I honestly believe I should have been born 500 years ago as opposed to now. Who wouldn't want to live in that? That would have been absolute paradise. And the landscape, I always tell people, if they dropped us off in some of our favorite places now that I like to go hiking, or other beachfront areas, we would be completely lost. We wouldn't know where we're at because the territory and the lay of the land would look completely different.
Wow. That I mean, that's interesting to me because you also consider that for the vast majority of time, this is actually how like this area this is how people lived.
Yeah.
And the other thing is like Santa Barbara, I grew up in Santa Maria, and we're the agricultural valley in the North County, and we're like the bedroom community and the blue collar town, and again the ag town. So Santa Barbara is like some of the most powerful people in the world live there. The Franciscans have never given up Mission Santa Barbara. Mission La Purisima is a state historic park, but San Ynez, Santa Barbara, nobody wants to go anywhere. They're keeping that,
Yeah.
and it's a
Yeah.
Franciscan college, and and part of why we know so much about the Chumash, I feel like archaeologically, and so much is who doesn't want to study at UC Santa Barbara, you know what I mean,
True.
and
It's a beautiful school.
yeah, but also this area is so plentiful and so beautiful. That's part of the Chumash had such a rich material culture, and there truly is so much to study.
Mhm.
It's just it's. I think 1824 is really interesting because it really looks at how this area was totally transformed. Because when you sit in Santa Barbara, you can see it. I mean, there's oil derricks in the channel. You know what I mean? And
Well, they put a whole, um, what is it? A whole airport on what used to be an island.
right, yeah, yeah.
So when you think about it, I mean, it to me, it just sounds absolutely insane that they thought of these ideas to change it this much, all for, money and status.
Well, um, that's the society we're living in, and I mean, the I guess that's how do you what do you think is a good way for, if we know that we're in this colonial, it's almost, I don't know, it's like a dome over everything, like that our society, we could go full Marxist and call it the superstructure, I guess, but you know what I mean, that just the thing that hangs over all of us as our society, but also the history and the legacy, like the missions, the romanticization of them, the kind of, like I said, the postcard ism of the missions.
Ugh,
Like, why
yeah.
is it worth reminding people what these things actually were? And it's not just, the point of talking about this stuff isn't just to make people feel bad, as it were. I have ancestors baptized at Mission San Luis Obispo, and so Spanish colonialism is part of my legacy being here in California. Doesn't hurt me to admit that, but what is it, how do you see, where we are now, and why do we need to talk about these things? How can we think about these things and discuss them, um, to help us move forward in some kind of way, in a better way, other than just, um, you know what I mean, not dwelling on the negative, but understanding that there was a lot here that needs to be understood, not shied away from, but really.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot of things in history we teach now. I say we, but it's not really like of the society we live in, this climate we live in, who always, every time September 11th rolls around, everybody likes to post, never forget, thousands of people were killed, the brutality of what happened. But we talk about it and we teach it, and it's talked about, and there's monuments dedicated to it, and everybody talks about it. It's the settler colonial system we live in has to acknowledge and cannot deny the fact that this has happened. And this is why I always took my children when they were small, now they're grown, I always took them to the mission systems to show them and let them know where our ancestors are buried. It's very gut wrenching to me. Santa Barbara Mission, we have a little bit of a relationship, and I'm very thankful to that. So I know, and they're straight out. They tell you your ancestors are littered through this area, not in a grave, but like a single grave. They kind of did a mass grave, laid everybody out, just all out on one thing, then later covered it with asphalt. But at least we know they're there. The Ventura Mission, I mean, we don't have the best relationship with them, and they've already called us liars publicly. So I feel like I've got nothing to lose. They've publicly admitted, they said they've lost 3,000 bodies. They don't know what happened to them. And it's
That's
like, I have grandparents that were buried there, aunts, uncles. It is so disheartening, and nobody seems to care, because they all believe if this was done under the guise of God and religion, that it's okay. We just have to get over it. And we don't have to get over it. I think that it needs to be taught in fourth grade. I think we need to talk about California natives. My son did a presentation when he was in fourth grade. Talked about, we offered a snack. We brought in a snack that Chumash would eat. We put together a presentation and he spoke on it. Was able to talk about the revolt and being the biggest uprising in Native American history in California, but it's never taught. I was very thankful for the teacher to open that space, because that doesn't always happen. I know, if we joke around, we call Ventura Kentucky. That's for a reason, because there's still a lot of pushback on the understanding and the teaching of this. Now, I think if people want to believe Father Sarah was a great guy, they can have that belief, but they have to understand that he did. People make mistakes. They do make terrible choices at times, and even though people say, well, that was how they treated people in those days, that doesn't make it okay. When was it ever okay to rape and kill and beat people savagely? That is not okay. So I think really talking about it, and I think it needs to be taught all the way up into the university, especially if you are attending a California university on Indigenous land. We have Channel Islands, we have Santa Barbara, we
Cal
have,
Poly is where I'm
yes,
going. Yeah,
you've got up the coast, all the way San Diego. We've got schools on these beautiful territory. Why are these schools so beautiful? They sit on former village sites.
yeah,
And this is, I was on a panel at UCSB almost a year ago, and I told them UCSB needs to openly admit it sits on village grounds. and they need to openly have an apology, a posted about how they apologize for not, and do something. I personally think that these universities should let Chumash. We have less than 1% of people in higher education that are Chumash. I think they can afford to allow free tuition to the students to get their bachelor's. That's just my belief. I actually had a call today with President Yao of Channel Islands University. There's a lot of work and a lot of things that go into it. And like people, their argument is like, I had to work for mine. They should have. We have lost entire generations of people. We don't have to keep giving or doing. It's so much is owed back. If we're never going to get our pieces of land back, then something needs to be done. And like I said, when, we just want a small piece of land to have, we do a lot of cultural classes. We do two language classes a month. We do a basketry class, plus we add in a cultural class. So we gather a lot. We eat, we talk, we have meetings. We don't need a mini mansion. I could have an op and an outdoor kitchen. We have a porta potty. We don't need that type of thing to in order to be productive and have what we need. Um, so there's just a lot that goes into it. And I think understanding who we were and who we are now, many people have a big gap. Unfortunately, because of colonization, did not get the at-home experience or teaching or learning from elders, because some people don't. We grew up with 4 generations in our household. Not everybody, people maybe 50, 60 years ago grew up like that. A lot of people don't anymore. And I'm not saying that it's their fault, but I wholeheartedly believe it's our responsibility to connect with other elders, to connect with other people, and try your best to learn from them, not take stories that may not be your family stories to tell. We really have to go back to those old teachings, because that's what preserved and kept us for thousands of years. That's all we really have left to hang on to.
I see that. What do you want people, people who don't know much about this, or don't know much about the Chumash, or maybe even this history? What do you hope they take from learning about 1824 and learning about how the Chumash lived before the missions, and then what they were prepared to do during that time?
I hope that they can really develop a deep understanding and some empathy towards how we used to live, that it wasn't a sinful way. We lived in peace and harmony with the land and with the animals, literally with the animals. We had relationships with them that almost nobody has these days. People go to college to become animal trainers, but they're learning textbook. They're not spending hours upon hours a day outside with wildlife and really becoming in touch with them. So I think people really need to dive deep and look at their own inner biases and prejudice, because we all have them. And think that, because I love, if somebody says I love my religion and I only believe in God, that's fine. But to understand that there was other people that had other beliefs and practices, and just because we didn't believe in this only one God, that we weren't evil or cruel people. We weren't sinners. We didn't know sin. We didn't need to be taught sin to say, you don't know what sin is, so therefore you're bad. That's just insanity. It
Yeah,
takes, I think, a lot of people to really get educated, read. I know the Santa Barbara Museum, the exhibit is partially closed. They don't have everything open, but there are a lot of great papers and books written by Jan Timbrook, by John Johnson. Yes, they are white people. I understand that, but they have held great relationships with many different Chumash My family, my daughters are the 4th generation that they've worked with. So it's beautiful when you see that they have dedicated a lot of their time to really tell this true story. Doesn't mean that they know everything. We don't, all of us don't know everything, and that's okay. But helping us bring back traditions, helping us practice these traditions, opening space and place for us to be able to do these traditions, because everything is privatized and we need to actually get
yeah,
permission to be on our own land. So
yeah,
I really want people to see how far and how deep that has affected us. It's done a complete 360 as people, and which is why our communities suffer so much with mental health and drug and alcohol abuse. Like, we really need to talk about it, and so many people still want to shy away from it and not speak truth to this. But it is, something that has, that generational trauma we know lives within us. and it takes time. And I'm a believer that we might not ever, some things we never totally heal from. It is a lifelong process, and it's like a roller coaster. It will come in waves at times, and you will be fine. Grief is just something real. They understand when their family member has passed away. They understand that if a cemetery or mortuary said we lost this body, or the whole gravesite has been dug up and they don't have an excuse for, there would be an uproar of nothing like we've ever seen before. It'd be all over the news. It would be, everybody would be stepping in to help and find out what happened. It didn't happen with us, and NAGPRA didn't come in till the night, till mid to late 90s. So you could essentially dig up anybody's remains and throw them out,
Oh
sell
my.
them online. This is what people do. It's horrendous. So I
Yeah.
think people really, like I said, like, need to look into their own biases and prejudice, and if they're a firm believer in religion or God, to understand that if you're following that religion, I personally don't believe that God would be hating on people because they didn't know what sin was or because they were sinners. I believe he would be there to help, which is why they need to really kind of look past their religion and look at people for just being human beings.
Yeah. Well, I have a photo up of this first Chumash burn that happened. How do you feel about um, situations like this where there is something, of course, never enough, hardly anything, not much at all, given back, but not just something given back, but when Chumash people get to take something back and make it theirs again, like land management in this case. I think I would love to hear your thoughts on the marine sanctuary that the Biden administration has just granted to the Chumash. But why don't you tell? I have the photo up of, I believe that's Ernestine and some folks, overseeing this burn. Can you tell me about that? And how do things like this, help today? With Chumash people, what they can do.
Well, I think one, it's very important for people to understand that California always had these cultural burns that were done. Native people did burns because some of our ethnobotanical plants need fire to regerminate. They need fire to kind of have that resting period, then rise up again. I think it's really important for Shumash. We have fire in almost every single ceremony we do. So you can imagine if we have no land, we can't have that main component. Fire is that element and water are very important elements to our ceremonies, our sacred ceremonies. So to be able to get into this space, we had been talking about it for a very long time, a few years. My cousin was actually on the Shumash Fire Department, one of the first ones years ago when it first started. And it was just always interesting to me because, like I said, my grandmother was Chumash plant medicine woman. So she had her own garden that she could do different things with and different things that she would show me. And everybody, the whole neighborhood thought she was crazy because she would, once it was in its phase where it went dormant, after a while, she knew when she could set it on fire. She knew when was the time to go out and break up the top layer, the crust from the all the ash, how to turn it. And she did everything, by hand, very little modern day tools. So I learned so much from her, but never really understood. It was kind of just what they did, and that was it. So to be able to put the reasons and understanding that it was done by women. The Chumash women did this. Older women did it. They taught the younger women. They started the fires. They controlled them. We had some help starting the fire, obviously, because Ernestine at this time was 85 and she can't bend down and she's not strong enough to get it going. But she did fan it and spread it. Understanding that fire is sacred. It has the power to give life, but it also, or sustain life, but it also has the power to take life. And so we have so many eras. That's in North Campus open space that was formerly a golf course. And so it took 25 years to restore that area to its natural native habitat. Why that's so important? Because with native landscape, we're still going to have fires, but we're not going to have the type of fires we're seeing today with so many invasive plants, and the invasive plants change the soil. So there's so many layers to it. But it's really important to understand. For us, this was a very emotional day. It was a hot day. We had sat through 3 other days, waiting for the weather to be right. And it just wasn't happening. So when it finally came the day that we could do the burn, it was a beautiful day because it ended up being warm. We were finally ready to do this. We had sat, like I said, for 3 other days. You literally get the call, we're going to try to do it today. And that's based on the humidity, the wind. You get out there, you go out there. And sometimes we just sat for hours and nothing would happen because the clouds would come in. And it's such a beautiful reminder that we don't work on our time. Chumash, in Western society, we have this clock we follow. We have a calendar that we follow. But in Chumash, that is not our time frame. Hutash, which is Mother Earth, Mother Nature, she lets us know when she's ready and when it's time for us to move. And I absolutely love that, because being able to follow it simply by the weather alone was just amazing, because you learn, if you didn't already know, then you're learning what to look out for, what components work, and what might work better in these modern days than maybe what grandma taught us or told us, because it was a different, 20 years, she passed away 20 years ago. Climate has changed quite a bit since then. It was very funny though, because by law we had to have firefighter on standby. You can't see them in the picture, but they weren't very far from us. They have to be like pretty close, and we were trying to get some distance so we could do our sacred stuff. And at the end, once it burned and it lit, my daughter, she yelled out, her war cry, and everybody jumped back and got so scared. They were just like, they didn't expect that in it. You wanted to, even though it was a sacred moment, we kind of giggled because we realized how much fear that still instills in people. They don't understand, and they think something is how we're going to do something or something's going to happen. But it was a very beautiful moment. Like I said, we waited a long time, and there's a couple of private landowners who have opened up their space and want to have this done on their land because they don't want these big fires. So we're in a lot of time, and it's so much, right? You have city fire, you have county. There's a lot that goes in. The politics that go into it is almost mind-boggling. And you have to be you have to be a game player. You have to be able to come and sit and talk to all these people. And sometimes people say things that are not, you don't want to hear. And sometimes it takes a lot to take a deep breath, let it in, let it out. Okay, let me explain these things to you. Or when you say this is harmful or hurtful, because instead of just attacking people, but it all comes full circle. It is just a lot of work to be able to do something that we used to do naturally. And it was outlawed 270 years ago, and in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And they went up, they put flyers everywhere, and they let people know at all costs, including, sexual assault, rape was I can't think of the word I'm trying to say, was focused on. This would happen to you if these women, if you decide you're going to light a fire, because there was still a couple of fires that were lit after it was outlawed. And so they wanted to make sure they let people know and make examples of them. So I was really nervous when we were doing this, because even though I know that they outlawed it just scared me. Like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine living in those times trying to practice. We know that there was different things that were practiced, and we often had lookouts to make sure the soldiers or people weren't coming. And it felt very much like that. I felt very worried. We're going to get in trouble? No, we're not getting in trouble. We're in modern day. But that fear, you've read so much, you've heard so much, you've heard stories from elders and ancestors. So it seems very scary in that moment, knowing that this has been outlawed for almost 300 years. And so to finally get it going it was just an amazing experience. I can't say enough about it.
Wow. Yeah, and fire is it's destructive, but it can also, it's a tool, right? And
Yeah.
but it was a tool of resistance too, right? So
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
yeah, so
Again, right, working with the elements, the horses, the
yeah, taken to the water, setting things on fire. I always remind people that the first Spanish tile to come to California was in San Luis Obispo, and that was the first Spanish tile roof at Mission San Luis Obispo, and it's because the Chumash there set the thatched roof on fire. So yeah, so something as ubiquitous as Spanish tile, there is a legacy to that, and it was, I call it counter-revolutionary architecture, right? So I'm trying to talk about this kind of flashpoint in California history because the missions were very transformative in a very negative way for the indigenous people, but then it becomes this equilibrium of, the metaphor I use is it's like the soup you're swimming in, right? Nobody, or fish don't taste salt, right? Fish in the ocean, they're not going around. It's really salty today. No, it's what they're used to, and so that becomes the backdrop. This colonialism and the missions just become part of. Oh, that's just old California, right? And I think people can. I think people are very open, and if they have a story told to them, and they can, understand this really happened 1824. There's more than enough documentation. There's more than
Yeah.
enough evidence this thing happened. I guess, what do you think you've learned from it? I love to hear about all this, the Chumash continuing to survive and keep their culture alive, despite all the forces that have worked in concert against y'all. I know the nation is resurrecting a dead language. There's so much work that needs to be done, but what do you hope people can how can they take this history that we're discussing, but make it mean something here and now? I really like to see the stuff you were just talking about, the land management, but if you have any advice for folks on the Central Coast, or any thoughts you want to wrap up with, I'd love to hear them, Marianne. And
Oh,
thanks again for joining me today.
there's so much that I
Yeah.
could go into. I think we call our language reclamation because we are trying to reclaim the ancient language. Now we do learn from Ernestine. She is the daughter of the last native speaker. So she grew up, she had the luxury of growing up in her household into her late 20s, early 30s, of listening to her mom speak the language.
Wow.
So that was, nobody else had that, that had a fluent parent. So that's really important. And I see that as just one of the biggest gifts that we could ever be given, is to learn from her and to talk to her and learn the stories. Now the ancient language, it is difficult, it's not easy. But a lot of things make sense to me. And why we say we're reclaiming it is because we're trying really hard not to add on that linguistic piece, even though we have a linguist, Chumash person that's getting their PhD in linguistics, because right, we live in a society where you need that piece of paper. You have to
Hmm.
be, you have to have that bachelor's, master's, or PhD, and then people will listen to you and talk to you. That's just the society we live in. So he will be, I believe, graduating this year with his PhD for linguistics. And so for us, that's really important because we're trying to learn the language and not assign all these American rules to how we speak it or how we write it, which I feel is much easier. Some people need that piece in order to, it helps them to understand and learn better. And it made so much sense to me if we kept it so simple. Like we said what we needed to say. We didn't add all these extra words and all these extra things. We didn't need all these extra words just to describe one word. Like we understood what we're trying to say. But I think people really need to, I'm hoping more books are written, but more books are written by Indigenous people that are actual factual books, because we have a few books out there, some of them like Island of the Blue Dolphins, right? It's not entirely true. It's a lot of fantasy, and I get that's what buys and sells, but we really need to tell the real story, the true story. Um, and it might not be, like people are expecting these, I guess, this very fetishized romantic version of what happened, but we need to tell it like it is. We need to learn the truth. And I think people just need to really look inside themselves and find out like what was going on, what happened, and knowing that because we've been so spread apart, not everybody has the knowledge, not everybody was grown in their communities. Life has changed, so much has changed for people, and that era of those last great elders, most of them are gone, and a few of them are slated to be on their way out, because we're never going to have elders like that live through these times, that are going to live through the beginning and the ending of mission times, beginning of what we know today as just this mass I don't know what to call it. I mean, I have some names for it, but I'm not going to say. It's just really educating themselves on the Chumash and who they were, and not just from maybe one group of Chumash. I guess the reason I say that, because there are different groups out there, and like anything else, it's kind of become kind of like a circus now. The most entertaining, the most embellished story. That's the most authentic, but that is not true. Look at our
Yeah.
history, visit the museum. I don't know when the Santa Ynez Reservation Museum is going to be open. We have been fortunate enough to have a couple of sneak peeks of it. It's absolutely amazing. I can't wait till it opens. I'm like, I want to live here. I just want to stay here
Wow.
all day. It's just so incredible. They did an amazing job with that. And truly, there's nothing else like that here in our area. So it would be really great for people to be able to see and just visit. I just get a real sense of peace of being out there in that garden.
Fantastic. Yeah, I've been waiting on that. Can't wait. I mean, that's talk about a whole other story, like just the story of how the Santa Ynez band was able to get Camp Four.
Oh gosh.
That's
Oh.
a yeah. I mean,
And that didn't
go,
come easy either, even at their status.
it did not come easy at all. Yeah, that I reported on that back in the day as and it was just that's but again that's a whole other story. You could take a whole podcast just to discuss that. But is there anything else you can think to add today, Marianne? I really appreciate as somebody the descendant of Chumash who were held at these missions, in present day Santa Barbara County. What do you? I guess do you have any parting thoughts or anything else you want to add, or anywhere you want to send anybody?
You know what? I should have emailed you the link sooner. Like I said, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was just thinking we were going to talk on the phone and kind of
Oh,
talk
that's
about
fine.
a few things.
Of
But I
course.
can I can send you the link after this. A
What
couple of
what what is it? I could maybe look it up real quick.
I do not have it off the top of my head. I'm so sorry. We
Sorry.
changed the link from an old one to a new one.
Oh, okay, no worries. What's the
But
organization then?
I would say maybe parting thoughts.
Oh,
Gosh, that's really hard. I would just say sometimes things aren't always as they seem, and sometimes it's really true. If things are too good or sound too good to be true, they probably are, and that kind of circles back to you were talking about the Chumash Marine Sanctuary. The Yaktititu Tilhini, which are the true and the only Northern Chumash, are the ones that should have the lead on this. And we have emailed the Biden administration, NOAA, and just to no avail. They've gotten thousands of comments, and they've chosen, yes, the San Ynez Mission, the Band of Mission Indians, that's the name that they go by, has a part in it. But they've also given control to a group that is mostly not Chumash ancestry. They might have some mixed tribal people from other areas and people that are just not Chumash at all. So it's really hard because they have kind of dressed this up as this is land back, the ocean area going back to the Chumash to maintain, to manage, and be involved in. And they've never spoken to us. They've kind of picked and choose who they were going to talk to. And that makes it hard because we still live in this society where if gosh, I hate to say this, if somebody is more I'm trying not to get in trouble for my choice of language. But right, we as Indigenous people are often seen as being angry and upset, but we have every right to be angry. We're tired. I mean, how many centuries do we have to keep going over and over, proving who we are, why we deserve? And sometimes doesn't mean we don't need all total control. Sometimes we just want to be a part of it and be involved in these discussions. However, oftentimes our voice is left out. And so whoever fits that white aesthetic, and sometimes these are people who are not Shumash and but just dress up, play Indian, are the groups that are chosen, or the people that are chosen to stand as us, for us. And it's just a really big problem, not only here in Chumash territory, but other indigenous cultures.
yeah. I wonder how do folks guard against that? I mean, it, you know,
That's a whole other podcast in itself.
Okay, we can't solve all the problems
Yeah.
today. Well, Marianne, I really appreciate you joining me here on Political Pain today. I'm going to hit the music, but if you want to hang around for a second and chat after, the recording will be over. But again, really appreciative to you, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time today.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, thank you.